Now we're in a position to look at Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is perhaps the first person, I think, in philosophy to recognize the power of that distinction, the power of the problem of getting the manifest and scientific images together. Hume sees the gap between is and ought, and he recognizes that that has important implications for our view of ourselves, but in a sense he says, look, I'm happy to go with the conclusion that there just is no self. And so he doesn't see it as a problem, he's happy to just toss out one side of the problem. But Nietzsche is somebody who says, wait a minute, actually I want to keep both sides. And yet the problem is that from the scientific image's point of view, everything we think about ourselves from the perspective of the manifest image is actually false. It's not just that I can toss all that away. If I throw that away, there goes civilization, there goes culture, there goes my understanding of myself, there go my reasons for action, the basis for me doing anything at all. I need the manifest image. I need the story it tells me about myself and my life to be able to live at all. But the scientific image says, but it's all false. And so Nietzsche is the first one maybe to see how that puts me in a very puzzling situation when I try to understand myself. Now, we are going to look at one particular stage of Nietzsche's thinking. He goes through a number of stages. He was a professor of classics at a Swiss university. He increasingly he ended up, partly for health reasons, resigning that post, but continued writing. And his views change over time. He starts out thinking about tragedy and discussing various things about ancient literature and identifying Dionysian and Apollonian tendencies. And then he goes through a period where he is a relativist. Most interpreters prefer to call him a perspectivist. I'm going to save that term for later in the course for something else, so I don't want to use it here. And at this stage of his thought, it seems to me he is quite simply a relativist. Now, later, his views change again. And that's why people don't really want to call him overall a relativist, because at a later stage, I think he does have a certain vision that emerges that is beyond relativism. But I want to look at that stage of his thinking in the late 1870s, the early 1880s, where it seems to me this is a fair description of his views. Anyway, what is relativism? It's the view that there are no universally valid truths about the world. So Protagoras was really I guess you might say, the beginner of relativism, an ancient Greek thinker who said man is the measure of all things. And he meant man, each individual person, that is to say, not just mankind in general, humanity in general, society or whatever. He meant each individual person is the measure of things. So let me take an example. Mushrooms. Are mushrooms tasty or not?
No.
Okay, how many are pro-mushroom?
Sure.
How many are anti-mushroom? All right, about 2/3, 1/3 pro-mushroom in this group. Yeah, you might say whether mushrooms are good to eat or not, whether they're tasty, is something that's really relative. I think they're wonderful. I love them. My wife hates them. And so you might say, look, they're great from my point of view. They're not so great from her point of view. There's just no universally valid truth about whether mushrooms are tasty or not. Or jokes are like this, right? What's funny? Often it's a highly individual matter. One of my favorite comics is Stephen Wright, the very deadpan sort of guy. And my favorite joke of his is very philosophical. In fact, I'll mention it later in the course. But I'll prepare you now, because nobody ever laughs at this joke. And maybe if you hear it more than once, you'll think it's funny. Anyway, here it is. He stands up there and he says, had a tough time this weekend. Got back to my apartment. Somebody broke in, stole all my stuff, replaced it with exact duplicates. All right, a handful of you think it's funny. Yay, you're my favorite class ever. Now, was that joke funny? Well, for a few of us, yeah, that's hilarious, right? Somebody broke into your place. They replaced everything with an exact duplicate. How could you tell, right? That's funny. How would you know? Yeah, it's kind of like that commercial where the woman in the ninja outfit goes behind and, replaces everything as it's stolen. It's like, if she really replaces everything with an exact duplicate, you'd never know you'd been wrong. So, I think that's very funny. But most of you sit there like, either I don't get it, or like, I get it, it's not funny. Okay, and that's the way it is with comedy. What one person finds funny, another person doesn't. No such thing as universally valid truths about comedy. But the relativist says, look, it's not just true for a few things where there really are matters of taste. It's true for everything. So they hold that all our beliefs are really relative to something. Now, Protagoras thought relative to each individual person. But you might think things are relative to a society, or to a culture, to a historical epoch, to an interpretive community, to use Richard Rorty's phrase, maybe to an individual person, maybe to something else. The idea is that truths change over time, or change with the culture, change with the society, change with the group. Now, there are certainly some truths that change with the society. So, for example, what is appropriate behavior? Let's say you're meeting somebody for the first time. What do you say to them? Okay, nice to meet you is what we commonly say. At an earlier era, that was thought to be extremely uncouth. It was, how do you do? How do you do? Okay, now that seems excessively formal to us, but at the time, that was the proper way to do it. To say, nice to meet you, or how's it going, or whatever, would be considered very informal and really inappropriate. Those things can change over time, even within a culture. But now, if I were in Central America, what would I say? I would say, yeah, I would say mucho gusto, or something like that, right? I would say something different. And that's going to vary with particular culture, particular language. There will be different expectations. But again, the question is whether everything is like that. So, here is Nietzsche's version. He says truth is relative to a historical period. What is true for us now is different from what was true for the ancient Greeks, let's say. What was true in the 18th century, what will be true in the next century. Truth is relative to a historical period. Now, there are certain things that really are true to a historical period, like, for example, what an appropriate greeting is, even within this society, this culture. That's changed over time. Other usages change over time. When I was a kid, hopefully meant with hope. Like, he looked hopefully at the sun, thinking about tomorrow, right? Now, hopefully tends to be used to mean, I hope that. Oh, hopefully it will be nice this weekend. Well, that doesn't make any sense the way I grew up. Like, what do you mean? It will be nice this weekend. It can't be hopeful. What do you mean? The world's hopeful? The world's sitting there hoping that it's nice this weekend? That doesn't make any sense. The meaning of the word changes. And sticklers still say everybody's misusing it. But eventually you give up and you just say, yeah, the word's used differently now. And so those kinds of things change over time. But again, the question is whether everything is like that. Well, I've mentioned some things that are relative, I think, to one thing or another. Forms of greeting, things that are appropriate in that context, or things that are funny, things that are tasty. What are some other examples of things that are relative to something, to an individual person, to a society, to a historical era? Yeah. Ah, what is beauty? Yes. What is beautiful? That's something that may change from culture to culture, from time to time. And so you might think, yes, what is an ideal, beautiful woman? Okay, over time, and you might look at that. You might look at it from society to society today, and people's images of that can differ. What about male perfection? You know, not every society is going to have me as an example of male perfection. That will vary from society to society, and it will change over time. What are some others? Yes?
What about physical standards?
Ah, physical standards. So what do you have in mind there?
Like, you know how back in the day, if you were like big, like medieval times, if you were big, you were rich, you had a lot of money and power. But nowadays, it's like, no.
Ooh, okay, good. Yeah, I think there are two elements to this. One is sort of what is a typical thing changes over time. So, for example, am I tall?
I think so. I mean, taller than average.
I'm kind of, yeah, I'm above average, but I'm not really tall. I'm actually, I'm the midget of my family. My brother's 6'4", my dad's 6'2", my uncle was 6'6", so I'm kind of little in that family. On the other end, in my wife's family, I'm a giant. I'm constantly having to go and there's a mirror on the wall, and I have to go like this to see in the mirror. And so, those things can vary over time. I would be very tall by the standards of the 17th century, for example.
Yeah.
And so those things change, but also now our expectations, what it means that somebody has a certain appearance. And so, for example, at one time, being fat was a sign of wealth. Poor people couldn't possibly afford to eat enough to be fat, and so actually having extra weight was something that was, a sign of high social status. Now, what are some signs of high social status? You see somebody and you immediately think, that person's rich and classy. What would be a sign of being rich and classy in our society?
People dress.
Good. How they dress. What else? The car they drive, maybe. What else? Yeah. Oh, okay. But yeah, enough on this. I mean, that's something that changes over time. The way the wealthy person looked and acted in 1900 is different from how a wealthy person would look and act today.
Okay, this may be a stretch, but what about scientific principles? Because what we know about science may change depending on the new research conducted in a different era.
Ooh, good. Now, scientific principles. What about that? Are they relative? Now, certainly the science changes, right? The science of the ancient Greeks is very different from modern science. In fact, for that matter, 19th century science is very different from 21st century science. But now the question really is, do the scientific laws themselves change? Are they relative to the historical era? Or is it merely our theories about them that change? Now that's where we start getting into the really difficult question. Because if we start thinking, are there things that are not relative, that do seem absolute, seem to hold in all cultures, all times, all places, for all people, you might think that scientific laws are an example of that. Okay? Give me an example of a scientific law. Okay, the law of gravitation. Gravitational force is equal to the gravitational constant times the mass of the first object times the mass of the second object over the square of the distance between them, right? The basic Newtonian law of gravitation. You might think there's an example of a scientific law. Now, admittedly, before Newton, people had not formulated that as a law. And indeed, then once you move to the theory of general relativity, you have a different perspective on what gravitation is, and you may want to modify or change that law. But those are changes in our theories. It's not a change in what gravitation is. Is it a change in gravity itself? Can you say, well, see, in Newton's time, gravity was a force that acted as a distance. But now it's just the curvature of space. In not 1905, when did Einstein publish his paper on the general theory as opposed to the special theory? 1915, thank you. 1915, see, gravity changed. Gravity said, man, I'm tired of all this. Acting at a distance is so hard. I'm going to curve space so I don't have to do it anymore. We typically say, look, the theory changed, but the underlying thing did not change. And so, at least many people have said, no, a scientific law is something that doesn't change. But Nietzsche, as we'll see, will actually agree with you. Will say, no, I actually think the science itself, the law itself changes. What are some other things you might think are not relative, are true universally for all people, all times, all places, all cultures?
I guess like disease, they've always happened, but our ways of curing it have always changed, or the theories of curing it.
All right, good. Our theories of disease have changed radically, but the disease, you might say, hasn't changed. And so that, now maybe it has, right? It might be that mutations have led to different diseases, different viruses, and so on. But you might think that at least some diseases haven't really changed. It's just that our understanding of them has changed. Yeah?
We all breathe.
Say it again?
We all breathe.
Oh, that we all breathe, yes. People breathe. Right? You might think, well, that may be true for you, but or that used to be true, but now, that seems like a pretty universally valid statement. Yeah. Time passes, right? That seems like a pretty universally valid claim. Yeah. Oh, all right, the sun rises and sets. We have a different understanding of what's involved in that rising and setting, but that's not something that we think, wasn't true for certain times of places. Yeah. Yeah, people die. Yeah, okay, that's something that seems universal. If you know a culture where that doesn't happen, let me know. Yeah.
Counting, math.
Okay, math, yes, 1 + 1 is 2, right? That seems like something that seems universally valid. It's not like in arithmetic, your teacher said, well, I'm going to teach you the arithmetic of the 20th century. It's going to be quite different in the next century, so keep in mind, you'll have to watch the newspapers. Maybe 1 + 1 will turn into 2.3 or something, but you feel like, well, these are eternal truths. So anyway, those are the places where it gets controversial. Mathematics, science, basic observations about the manifest image, like people get sick, people die, people breathe. and so on. Those seem like good candidates for truths that hold at all times and all places. Here is what bothers Nietzsche. You might think that although our scientific theories change, there is something in the background that remains constant. Something like scientific method, the laws governing reason itself, logic. Understood broadly to include inductive logic, the way in which we reason about hypotheses we learn on the basis of observation about the world. And so you might think, yes, our theories of the world have changed, but the underlying physical laws have not changed, the laws of mathematics haven't changed, and moreover, our basic tools in thinking, logic, scientific method, those really haven't changed. Or if they have changed, maybe they've changed in predictable ways, in ways that are themselves rational. Yes, scientific method. We have a much more sophisticated understanding of that now than people did in ancient Greece or during the medieval period, but still, it's something that has changed in a way that's understandable. Nietzsche says, wait, what if that's not true? What if even our theories have not changed in a rational way, so that whole process of you might say, the transformation, the dynamics of thought, has not been a rational process. So, he says, yeah, it's not just the particular theories of the world that we have. Our particular scientific theories have changed. What if the way in which we approach the world has changed? What if our theories about theories, our conceptions of scientific method, our conceptions of logic, our conceptions of reason itself have changed in such a way that actually we can't find anything constant? It would be nice if we could say, well, yes, we agree with the ancient Greeks about this, about at least logic, about scientific method and so on. But what if we can't find anything like that? What if we can't find any place where we can put down an anchor and say, well, everybody at least agrees on this? So he says, nearly all philosophical problems now raise the same form of question they did 2,000 years ago. How can something develop from its opposite? For example, reason from the unreasonable, feeling from the dead, logic from the illogical, disinterested gaze from covetous wanting, altruism from egoism, truth from error. Here is what he has in mind, that gap between the manifest and the scientific images. He's saying, what is that all about except the claim that our ordinary ways of understanding the world and of ourselves arise somehow out of their opposites. That is to say, reason at the manifest image level arises about something that is utterly unreasonable. That isn't a question of reason or thinking about acting for reasons at all. We have logic at the level of the manifest image, arising out of something that's pure biochemistry, something that is utterly illogical. We have feeling at the level of the manifest image, but arising out of things that are purely dead. Electrons, protons, neutrons, their motions, fields, and so on. Those things don't have feeling. It's like, how are your electrons today? That doesn't make any sense, right? Somehow feeling is supposed to arise out of this realm that has no emotion to it, where things are purely governed by physical laws. How do we get altruism from egoism? It looks like at a certain biological level, we are beings concerned with our own survival and propagation. How do we get out of that any sort of ethical behavior? How do we get truth out of error? He says everything we need, and that can be given to us only now that the individual sciences have reached their present height, is a chemistry of the moral, religious, and aesthetic conceptions and evaluations. So in other words, we use lots of terms at the level of the manifest image for understanding the world and ourselves. We think about things in terms that are moral. We describe certain actions as right, others as wrong, certain things as unjust, certain things as virtuous. On the basis of what? That doesn't have any place in this scientific worldview. Ultimately, all of those judgments themselves arise for biochemical reasons out of the structure of our brains. What about religion? Where does that come from? There isn't any God at the level of purely scientific description of the world. And so, where do we get our religious sensibilities? Why do people go to church or synagogue or temple or mosque? Why do people pray? Why do people have a conception of spirituality if really in the end all they are is purely physical beings controlled by physical laws? What about aesthetics? We refer to certain things and certain people as beautiful. We have aesthetic reactions to certain things. There are certain movies that we find very powerful and very beautiful. Other things we think are lame. Where do those aesthetic judgments come from? Well, that too is a way of putting value on the world. And how does that arise out of something that purely, well, seems to lack those ideas? So we get moral ideas, religious ideas, aesthetic ideas at the level of the manifest image. They are supposed to be explained by things purely at the level of the scientific image. He says, well, where are the explanations? Let's find those explanations. It looks as if that's what we have to do to understand ourselves. But now he thinks actually it's more complicated than that, because actually he doubts whether all of those things arise in purely rational ways. He suspects that actually they don't arise in terms of laws that we can actually understand. And so he says in the end, a lot of life is really irrational. It is driven by the will to power. And so he says, what if this chemistry would reveal that in these areas too, the most glorious colors arise from low, despised materials? What if it turns out, in other words, that our highest sentiments, our moral sentiments, our religious sentiments, our aesthetic sentiments, all in the end just reduced to biochemistry, and in fact are driven by a will to power, are not things that actually arise out of anything rational or beautiful at all, but instead arise out of simply physical combinations and physical laws, maybe together with our own selfish desires at the level of biology. Well, that's a gloomy picture, right? A gloomy picture of the self. I don't want to think, look, I'm just biochemistry together with this biological drive to survive, and all these beautiful philosophical thoughts I have, it's all just biochemistry. I might as well be a duck quack. Right? That in the end, there's no real difference. Why does the duck quack? Well, we can explain that in terms of its underlying neurophysiology, let's say. Why does Bonnevach write papers about the logic of reasons? It's just his biochemistry. And I don't like that vision of myself, but maybe that's the way it works. Well, let's get to the specifically historical point. He says philosophers automatically think of man as an eterna veritas, an eternal truth, as a constant in the flux, a safe measure of things to come. Everything that philosophers say about man is no longer fundamental, but tells us something about the men of a very limited period of time. Lack of historical sense is the hereditary error of all philosophers. So in short, he says, and I think he would apply this not just to philosophy, but to psychology, to sociology, to all sorts of fields, he would say, it's not a question of finding out what the mind is like, what human nature is like. It's a question of finding out what the mind is doing these days, what human nature is like right now. These things do not have a kind of constancy across time. They are things that develop and arise out of specific historical settings. They last for specific historical periods. So it's not just that it's different people who were existing in ancient China or ancient Greece. They were really thinking about things in a very different way. Their natures were different, or at any rate, incomparable to ours. What's said of those people, what they said about the world, that might hold for their period of time, doesn't necessarily hold for ours, or so he says. So he says everything became what it is. There are no eternal facts. There are no absolute truths. So from now on, we need historical philosophizing and the virtue of modesty. We need to say, well, here, now, here's how it looks to me. And that's very different from the claim, here's the way it is, period. In ancient times, Augustine responded to the skeptics by saying, all right, maybe you're right. Maybe I can't know that sugar is sweet, but I can at least know that it tastes sweet to me. And that's the kind of modesty that Nietzsche is recommending. Don't say, here's the way it is. Say, here's the way it looks to me. Okay, here's the way it seems to me. That's the most we can really do. Now, there's something actually deeper. I mentioned the conflict between the manifest and the scientific images. He says, what we call the world is the result of a number of errors and fantasies which have gradually developed through the whole evolution of organic nature, have intertwined with one another, and now left us as the cumulative treasure of the past. A treasure because the value of our humanity rests on it. It is civilization. It is our understanding of ourselves. It is the manifest image, in short. That is our heritage, but it's all false. It gives us an image of ourselves as rational beings engaged in practical reason, in pursuit of our hopes and desires and dreams. And none of that is right. That's not who we are. But we depend on that error. We depend on that fantasy. So, the world of value, the world of what is frightful, delightful, all of that is passion, error, self-deception. All of that is something we need to live, but on the other hand, it is all false. Life is based on a conception of the world and of ourselves that is radically false, folks. Well, what does that mean? It means, he says, we have to rethink everything. We have to, first of all, realize that our thinking is something that arises out of our feelings, and those arise out of this unknown biochemistry. So the thoughts, they're merely shadows of our feelings. Darker, empty, simpler. Emptier, simpler. Here you should sort of hear the echoes of Hume, right? That it's feeling that takes us from is to ought. But also, he says, we've got to become playful. We've got to recognize that actually describing the world is, from our own perspective, a hopeless task. The most we can do is become playful. Hence the title of his book, often translated as The Gay Science or The Joyful Wisdom. I think I translated it in your reading as The Cheerful Science. Maybe even better would be The Playful Science. The German word there is Fröhliche, which is like frolicking in English. It suggests this playfulness. And that's something that is required in our understanding of the world. Why? Because really, the world is a projection. It is something that's really black and white, but we've colored it in, and we've thought it's really like that, but in fact, we have been the colorists. Now, final thought in our last 2 minutes. His claim, his most radical and most famous claim, that God is dead. He says, after the Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous shiver-inducing shadow. God is dead, but given humans as they are, there may be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow is shown. And we still have to defeat his shadow. So here's the most famous passage where he announces this, the passage of the madman. Haven't you heard about that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning, ran to the market, and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God! I'm looking for God! There were many who stood there who didn't believe in God, so he excited much laughter. Is he lost, said one? Did he wander off like a child? Does he keep himself hidden? Is he afraid of us? Did he go to sea, emigrate? They laughed and yelled in disorder. He's here echoing the taunts of Elijah against the priests of Baal. Nietzsche hates Christianity, but I will say his father was a Lutheran pastor. So there's a lot of psychodrama here, okay? But he knows a lot of the Christian tradition very well. In any event, yeah, there's Mount Carmel and Elijah. Now, he says, well, where is God? I will tell you, we have killed him. You and I, we are all his murderers. God is dead. God remains dead. How can we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Don't we have to become gods just to be worthy of it? It took 7 decades, but Time magazine, finally in the 60s, had a cover. Is God dead? Here's my favorite response. God is dead. Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead. God. Anyway, here's why he worries about this. He thinks that implies that there are no absolutes.